Hi, I'm Lara Fresko, and I'm a writer and an occasional curator. Um, I'll be reading a little bit because I don't want to ramble on forever. Um, I would just like to begin by thanking everyone because it's been quite a learning experience for the past 2 days. We've heard a lot about case studies from Oslo and elsewhere, and even though it's a different setting, I think it speaks a lot to what we can learn from, what we can think about here. Also, before I begin, I want to say that the opening of the urban exhibition is at 6:30 on Saturday, and the talk is at 5 p.m. So that's that. So to begin this wrap-up, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself and tell you about the perspective I'm coming from. About 2 weeks ago, I joined the political party, which is odd for me, but I'm now a candidate for the Municipal Assembly of Şişli, which is just off Gezi Park. What led me to this leap of faith was something similar to what Alexis Chanel expressed yesterday, that if you believe and try, you might just make it happen. And this perhaps resonated also with Anna Beata's phrase, making the possible possible, and but also with Defne's comment about pushing the limits of the possible as well. The cynicism and disbelief caused by the burden of the city in particular and the world in general perhaps can sometimes be overpowering. But though I find the idea that nothing existed before Gezi outrageous, I also acknowledge that it was a moment of crystallization for me as well as others. So this break happened, where we thought, heck, why not? Maybe we can actually do something. Which is why I begin with the second from last rule in the new rules of public art booklet, which is suspend your disbelief. And I think this is one of the only rules that should never change. I think it's a great rule. So the party I joined is one which is committed to local and self-governance. So public space is often an issue that is discussed, and considering the crazy rhythm and climate Turkey is going through right now politically, it actually feels good to talk about public space. Although I'm sure many will say that the large-scale corruption scandals going on nowadays have everything to do with public space, and they would be right. But there's also a sense that the scale of those scandals is so huge that you can't really intervene. Whereas when you work on a smaller scale, sort of local level, it feels a little bit like human scale architecture rather than grandiose spaces. So this is the perspective I'm coming from. Vasif opened the floor on the first day by asking seemingly very simple questions. What is our role as citizens in making public space? I think this is a very important question, and something which is particularly important to perhaps this institution, many people here, Vasif himself. How do we rethink our daily practices as well as our work, in this case the programming of the institution, after we've experienced something like Gezi, and do it without turning it into a sham? So Claire's talk began by asking the audience who was here what our interests, our professionalizations, our work and expertise was. And not surprisingly, there were many not directly involved with the arts. And this sort of pool of experience and knowledge was an important thing that sort of, I think, was traced throughout the talks. But since Irvin is here, I'd really like to talk about one particular project that we talked about. That's Alex Hartley's Nowhere Island, Um, the moment this was mentioned, I thought about the Neue Slowenische Kunst, which is something similar. And just to give a little bit of a background, Irvin is, as they said, a part of a larger collective of collectives, commonly referred to as the NSK. And this sort of came about in the early 80s when Slovenia was still part of socialist Yugoslavia. In 1984, still half a decade until the fall of communism, the NSK was established. So Borut and Miran have given more details on the way that their embassies across the world work, how to get a passport. Perhaps they can talk a bit more about that. But the thing that strikes me in the two projects is the sublimation of the idea of a nation to an idea of a deterritorialized community, a translocal community, if you will. Particularly in the case of Irvin, I'm interested in how this sublimated idea of a community is born out of a collection of collectives. So I'm interested in the process of taking initiative, which is what I was talking about when I was sort of questioning the other conversations. This will bring me to Anna Beata's talk yesterday, which I think made the audience simultaneously jealous and uncomfortable. Jealous because it seems like a faraway land where there's a culture of consensus, which I don't know what that means. I'm sure they would say that they have a lot of dissensus going on. And uncomfortable because despite the sense of distance where there were things that resonated with the urban transformation process going on here. For example, Anna Beata mentioned that the area is not a residential area, but a port area. A similar sort of urban transformation is taking place, or is sort of still a threat in Topane and other places. So, okay. So, surely there may be a world of differences between the case of Norway and what's going on here. And, you know, I'm all for difference. So, I will acknowledge that. And most of the things I'm saying right now is an attempt to make a transition to thinking about the case of Istanbul. My question to Anna Beata's presentation yesterday was this, and I think it's worth repeating if only to make this transition. It seems, I said, that while private property, the fenced areas, are under legal protection, the public areas, the unfenced areas, are not protected against being fenced. So every area that is public is always under the threat of being not public and then falling under the jurisdiction of someone we expect to be a do-gooder. So what we are encountering in Turkey right now, as many forest areas, green areas, public spaces, old public school lots, and even archaeological sites which are considered part of World Heritage are being opened up for construction, whether it be dams or residential areas or business zones. The model where making public space is entrusted on the construction companies seems a little bit naive and doesn't necessarily work. It's also unsustainable and not necessarily dependable. So Claire's point to this was a great point, which I think I've referred to today with the financial term, bricolage, which is actually a very social science term. Claire's point to this was that in order to make things happen, we will always depend on different structures, different opportunities. Where one fails, we will find the opportunity elsewhere, which is an understandable entrepreneurial spirit. I think it would also be interesting to think about this in as a local policy issue, or as an issue of collectivities that don't necessarily transform it into an institution. I don't know whether we would call urban an institution right now. I don't think so, or even the NSK. But of course, the NSK also embraces being an institution. So there are different ways of becoming an institution. So there are things there are these words that we can think about and we signify. So I have extracted these keywords from the talks of the 3 days, and they don't necessarily have to connect to each other. They're taken out of their context, but I thought this was a very good way of beginning to talk about what we've talked about. For example, from the second from bottom, change. How can we affect change? How do we want to affect change? What way do we want to go in? These are words that are being used, in Obama's campaign in 2008, it was all about change. And today, if you ask many of his supporters, change, yes. I mean, doesn't necessarily resonate as much as it did back in the day. So I think these words, taken out of their context, can be opened up into different readings that might be productive for the discussion going forward for Istanbul. So let me end on this note. There's much to be done right now, especially in Istanbul. I think there's great potential. There is a draft law being worked on right now on an art institution that they say will take its spaces as the British Arts Council, which I doubt is the case, but this is an issue that the art community has been trying to intervene in. And of course, it's difficult. There are other things, there are local politics going on that will affect change. There are collectivities happening throughout the art community. There's Turuncu Çadır, which we haven't met in a while now, but there are things happening. So let's see. I would like to go over rules 3, 4, and 9 now. I love the rules, so I really like. We didn't talk much about the rules, but I think the rules were nice. Create space for the unplanned. Don't make it for a community, create a community. Welcome outsiders. So this may be welcome insiders as well. And I'll leave it at the last one, which I think is a great last rule. It's like get lost or get lost. And when you first mentioned getting lost and art sort of working as a mechanism, not necessarily of making things more comfortable, but rather sort of pushing you to get lost a little bit, I thought of Walter Benjamin's famous phrase that it's very easy to find your way in a city, but it's much harder to get lost. So that I'll leave it on that note, and then I'll open this and open the ground for conversation.
Back to your favorite.
This one?
No, come back to my previous.
This?
Yeah. I'm just curious, that's an interesting set of. Most of them are from yesterday.
Images from the first day.
First day. Yeah.
Colonialism is from the first day. Let's see. Contract is from the first day. Slow is from the first day. Rules are from the first day.
No, I'm just trying to figure out this, looking at this, just that this kind of constellation it is in a very strange way. But one find they hold this will be yours, which is I guess some term. I mean, this kind of got stuck with all of us, or maybe perhaps. It certainly did. Still resonating with me. Um, and also got stuck on this yours thing. What does that imply? Is it people who are looking at it? I mean, does it imply a multitude? But who was getting to see it? I'm curious. I mean, was it all over the city or?
Yeah.
And which means that who was looking at it?
Well, as I understand it,
The construction workers, maybe?
construction. I mean, I think that was an example for me. That was from the temporary program before I started working there. And I think that was an example for me. Do you remember when we were talking about critical agitation and kind of poking a stick at regeneration? For me, that, even though it was a very resonant phrase, the problem with it for me, if I'd been the curator, I would have been saying to the artist, yeah, you've got to fly it over the whole city. Because the point is, it's kind of for it to resonate, it can't be an empty gesture with no one looking at it other than the seagulls. And so if you want it to have political resonance, then it needs to have an audience to it. So I guess that for me was that question. But just going back to your points, I thought what I'll take away, which is really powerful for me, is I think this question of occupation, which has to do with bringing up Vasil's point there. I think it has to do with ownership, for taking space, being given permission to act out in space, and who gives the commission and the permission, and bringing in a couple of things maybe to that from today's discussion. I think there's a question there about experiment.
Sure.
And I think Russell's point there about the problem of experiment becoming a kind of fashion, rather than having any impact. And I think Daphne's point about is kind of, that is the gesture hollow if it exists within a space that's protected and that doesn't speak to anyone. So maybe this will.
It kind of rhymes with something else, which Lara, another artist who showed right at the beginning, which was the kind of the sitting units of the benches, and these units that were designed for drug users and making unit or the early work. But Lara had made a work in Istanbul in 2005, which sat on the roof of İKSV at the present time, which said in English, "The world is yours." If you recall, the world is yours, and one day all this will be yours. And interestingly, the world is yours, as quotation, etc., but consciously put it up there in English. So it was kind of purposefully pushing 99% or 90% of the city out. That even in its very inscription, it was saying that actually no, it's not yours. And it kind of works. The sighting of one day, this will be yours, and the way it uses this, it uses kind of the space, the sky, the area. And the sky is not supposed to belong to anyone, I guess, which is not true. But,
what I didn't quite like about that work was it was a balloon, which tended to suggest that at any moment, a little bit like the cat sort of came and scratched it the whole thing all along. So it was kind of nice gesture.
That phrase made you remember what the years were living with.
Yeah, it made me also think about the Martin Creek word, which says everything is going to be fine, and it's kind of just like commenting on that everything is not fine right now.
I think part of it is about encroachment, and I hadn't thought about this until I spoke to Miran right now, but I don't know where they are. They are, okay. He said, well, what does public art mean? And I was like, oh, because for him, there is no art that is in public. But of course, there is this encroachment that as public space is being fenced, so is art. Or we can think of it that way. So public art has become a thing only as far as it's being privatized. So why are we talking about public art is also a question.
Maybe, I don't know whether this is right or not, I'm just going to put it out there, but maybe there's a comparison of what they were talking about in the beginnings of the institution. So they were talking about how, in a sense, they weren't an alternative because there was nothing in their mind that was worth being an alternative to, yeah? So they were it. So maybe there's something here in the forms of public art that we're talking about, and that I don't see them as alternative forms of public art because I don't see the things that are professed to be public art to be art. So these new forms of public art just are public art. There's something there about that. I think the new rules are kicking against this question of permanent monuments and everything else, but I just see them as forms of art.
Well, I think
public or otherwise, really.
Some of the rules really do make them more public. Like, it's not forever. This is a issue that is, I have to send you this essay. I haven't. But there is this workers' monument down in Topane, and it was placed there by a government in the 90s or 70s? 70s. And of course, it did not resonate with the people living there at the time, but the neighborhood people sort of got used to it being there and sort of playing around it, and they didn't, it was torn down so much that it didn't look like a worker at the point in which an artist collective attempted to come and take it away. Because they thought, like Hafriyat Collective thought, no one would care. They would be like, let's take this public monument away and let's see if anyone cares. And they assumed that no one would. But the people from the neighborhood really resisted. So this was an interesting thing. The longer something stays there, there's also this change in generations of people. The meaning of the monument might change. It might become invisible. It might become something not desired. It might be something that wasn't desired in the first place. So there are all these sort of segments of how a public monument that is supposed to stay there forever works.
But I think maybe as a final point, that brings us back to the very first discussion that we had around public time. That you can't consider public space the boundaries and parameters of what's considered to be public, or what is fenced and what is encroached and what is occupied, without public time. Because 100 years ago, 200 years ago, what was Gezi Park? So the value of
it was the cemetery.
Yeah. So the value of the space and the perception that it is being encroached changes over time. But it means that it's very particular, and the same goes for whether it's a monument or a public sculpture. It becomes part of a story of a place and accrues different kinds of values. It could be anything. It could be a fountain. It could be a tree. It accrues different values. And I think that's a fascinating thing. And that's what's so much more interesting to them when you're that urban design. It's about time and space. It's not just about a map location.
Anybody? Please. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming and joining and participating. Although participating, I don't know. So, have a good evening.